interested, so thank you for your attention, and thanks so much to Paolo for the invitation. I really appreciate it and the chance to come here and share work. So as Paula said, I'm a composer from Canada. I recently moved to Germany, living in Berlin now. And I think I will start by performing a piece and then talk a little bit about it. And if you have any questions, you feel free to ask them. And then I will also show a little bit of some other related work on the video and talk a little bit more broadly about my practice in general. And hope you enjoy. Thank you for your attention. So this is a piece that I composed in 2012 called Reasons for Amplified Books and Electronics. Thanks for listening. So my background originally is as an electroacoustic composer. How many of you are familiar with or practitioners yourselves of electroacoustic music? Some people, yes? Right.
I think they study here, it's part of the...
Right, yes, okay. So in this kind of music we have the experience of going into a studio, maybe with an everyday object or an instrument, and making recordings with it in order to try to manipulate the sounds to create some new experience with it. So it could be, for example, you go into a studio and you have your found object or your sounding object, like this piece of duct tape, for example, and then trying to use the microphone to discover new things about the sound, you know, like this, and exhaust the sort of sounding potential of what this object can make, and then going in using software processes to try to manipulate it and to create some kind of poetry with the sounds that maybe we hear in our everyday. And so with this piece, I wanted to bring that kind of experience and practice to something that could be performed live on stage. And so it was a commission from a percussionist who asked me to write something for him that he could only play with just his hands. And sorry, I'm going to take a drink of water. Altitude here is something else. So we went into the studio, and very much like with the recorded music, played around with a lot of different objects, and I was thinking about taking this experience that I had making electroacoustic music, and rather than writing for some drums or instruments that we could play, we settled on, well, why not books, you know, something that's very familiar, something that we use in our everyday. And we went in, and just like a lot of the sounds that you heard in the piece, tried to go through it. Well, what happens if we kind of, you know, make these scratchy sounds on the side, or if we get hit it, we can squeeze the papers to get some pitch out of it. And then from this process, then I assembled a mock-up of recordings, like I would if I was composing an electronic piece, and then tried to notate it. And so, in this case, I used a graphic notation. So I'm going to project it here on the screen a little bit. So this is the score of the piece that you just heard. And so it resembles a little bit the traditional musical notation where you're looking left to right. We don't have exact rhythms, but we have a timeline. So from the beginning of the piece, 0 seconds to 5 seconds in. And we have some dynamic markings you can see here, fortissimo, pianissimo, etc. But there's a great degree of freedom in how you can kind of interpret this. Using graphical signs, which are have a legend here. So this like black triangle means to when the book close, the white triangle means to hit the cover. We have these little kind of squeaky lines that show to flip the pages, etc. One staff for one book, basically, so I have 2 microphones, a stereo effect to try to get the sound moving in space a little bit, and a third staff for the electronic part, which is controlled with the foot pedal that I have on the ground here. I can synchronize different performed actions with the books with pre-recorded elements and some live processing. You heard some reverb, you heard some resonators that kind of turn the books into gongs, sort of. And so, why do this? Why am I interested in this? I think from my background in electroacoustic music, I was really especially interested in music that can connect us with the real world and our everyday experiences. Coming from Vancouver in Canada, there's a rich tradition of soundscape music, thinking about the environment and acoustic ecology. What's our human relationship with our environment and our sounding environment and how we listen. And so thinking about something that's familiar to us in our everyday, like a book, and trying to build a new relationship with it and explore its sonic potential, to me is a way addressing our own listening relationship with our environment. And so, for example, if you have a musical performance with a musical instrument like a violin, most people have a kind of a schema, an experience of what a violin is and what it should do in a musical context. So, you have a musical stage, somebody comes on, they perform, they have this violin. You kind of know what's going to happen, right? The violin is there to produce music. And so it already gives you lots of cues to pay attention to the sound in a particular way. You know, whether it's a melody or something more elaborated, an extended technique or something strange that you're doing to the violin. Your attention is kind of focused in this oral way. You're paying attention for the sounds and thinking about the quality of the sound, or maybe you're suspending your analysis and judgment and allowing the sounds to take you somewhere in your imagination or move you emotionally. But usually, unless the piece gives you another kind of context to think about it that way, you're not thinking for very long, oh, that's a violin, that's a violin. Your attention is not drawn toward the object itself, and you're not necessarily thinking about the history of the object and your relationship with it. Performing with an everyday object like a book, I don't know what your experience was, but certainly me, when I go to a performance like that, my first thought is really drawn, the attention is toward the object. I'm thinking about books, I'm thinking about their meaning, my personal relationship with them, maybe some memories that I have with books. And so I'm really interested in this kind of confrontation between that attention, where you're drawn to thinking about something that is part of your everyday life, and your history, maybe other histories that you're aware of, the kind of meaning that you might attach to it, and then what happens to it on stage, these kind of sonic experiences. So very quickly in the piece, you know, I think like with the violin, you stop paying attention too much to the object as well, and then, oh, what sounds can we make with this object? And for me, that's a chance to create a sort of playfulness in your listening, so that you have the chance to think about the sound in lots of different ways. You might pay attention first to the meaning of the sound, and then to your personal relationship to it. Then you're thinking analytically about the music, and that gives you a sense of permission, perhaps, to go back and forth between different ways of listening. And so that's something that I'm really interested in my music in general, whether I'm writing a string quartet, or a piece for piano, or orchestra, or something like this, which is an everyday object. So I'm interested in composing music in general that affords this sort of playfulness of listening. And so I hope that you had an experience like that. But if not, I think that one of the really interesting things about music is that it gives us lots of different ways to listen. So before I go on and talk about other work, I'm curious if you have any questions, or if you want to share any of your experiences while listening to this work, if you listened in maybe a different way than I suggested.
Yeah, how do you approach structure? It's very clear what you explained to us. Actually, one of my questions was if there was scores, and now I see that there is indeed a score. But about structure, do you want to show only what is possible to do with the object and the electronic processes, or there is also a clear musical structure, like if there would be in any other instrumental piece?
I think that's a really good question. And you can talk about different approaches to structuring music, and one way of dividing it is between whether you have a structural idea first, for example, a harmonic structure or temporal structure, coming in and having a framework, then you fill in the form with the content, right? And so I know I want these harmonies, and I want it to start here and then go there, and then the actual sounds that happen emerge out of that structure. Another approach is to look at the sound itself, whether it's a piano playing or a book, and try to think, what structures might emerge from that sound. And so I think that was really my approach with this piece. As I mentioned, the process was really like going into the studio with the percussionist and just trying to see what sounds we could make with it. And so I think that these kinds of things tell us a little bit about structure. There's a French composer called Guy Ravel, who's in this tradition of electroacoustic music in France, working at Radio France in the 60s and onward, who refers to this process as a séquence-jeu, like a game sequence. It's kind of hard to translate, but I really think about it as this kind of improvisation. You know, you're kind of looking at something and seeing what does it tell you, trying to listen, you know, to the book and see like how does this tell me how to compose rather than trying to rely on my own expectations or plans, right? But of course I have my own expectations and plans as well. I'm a composer and I have my preferences and things that I like. So in addition to the process of this piece unfolding, resembling that improvisational structure. So, I mean, the first sound of the piece is a book closing, right? To me, that was the most obvious and the most immediate thing that I can do with a book. You know, it has the spine, it opens, and so that's kind of the central idea of the piece. The first, like, sound object of the work, if you like, is this idea of the closing. And so that gives me that's sound number one, so it's really important. This idea that this is a structural element of the piece, and so as it goes on over time, every time this happens, it's signaling you to pay attention in a different way. And so I use that, stemming from that kind of improvisational experience, as something that I then went on and structured the piece around. So this kind of tells me that now I can show a new sound. After I've done this once, twice, 3 times, each time I can introduce a new sound, a new idea. And then beyond that, I wanted to think about a gradual evolution of attention, talking again about like, first your attention is drawn toward the object, so I wanted to start really very simply like one sound, another sound, demonstrating kind of pedagogically what the materials are. These are the notes on the scale of my instrument. And then what else can you do from that? Then I bring in the electronics. First little sounds are kind of little subtle colorations of the sound. And then we get into processing. As we bring in the electronic manipulations, first reverb, bringing this sound into a different space, or resonators, thinking that there is some resonance already in the sound. You can hear a little bit of pitch there, boom, you know. So how can I bring that out more with electronics? And so the piece really proceeds in this kind of way where it's about responding to what I hear in the object. And then also following that idea of attention. So first it's really important to the piece that it's a book and the attention is drawn toward the object. And then my way of kind of moving away from the object into a more abstract world is first by the sequence of actions. So the more that you do this, the less you think about it's a book, and then you think more about the sound. And then as the electronics come in, I think about other sounds. So for instance, you have this flapping that kind of reminded me of like rain falling on the ground. So it's really through this kind of stream of consciousness, free association of like, if you can hear rain and the sounds of paper rustling, then let's bring that out and I bring a recording of rain that happens at the same time. Or this sounds like wings fluttering, right? So then I bring in bird wings and have a transformation from this sound into another sound. And then bird calls, because then there's an intellectual association between the sounds of bird wings and bird voices, and so on and so forth. So that's more or less how I generated the structure of the piece.
Can you talk about how do you categorize the symbols of the music in the score?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is there like default? Fonts, or you create your own based on from the kinetic side, or how do you categorize the symbols?
Good question. So it's a bit idiosyncratic. I wouldn't say there's like a default. It is my own notation that I developed for the piece, but it's very related to the kind of graphic notation that occurs in electroacoustic music for diffusion scores and images of typologies of sound. So if some of you are familiar with work of Pierre Schaeffer, you know, the originators of these kinds of things, then trying to classify different sound archetypes get associated with these kinds of symbols. So it's really natural for this book slamming sound object to have this triangle shape because it represents a little bit what happens in the waveform of a sound. You know, it's a quick transient, there's an attack, decay, and so there's just a sudden spike of energy and then nothing. So this is the same kind of thing, you know, for this squeezing sound effect. It's a longer sound and there's kind of irregularity in the sound. So I tried to show that, and there's a degree of relationship between what you can see, for example, on a waveform or an oscilloscope if you listen to one of these kinds of sounds, but it's a bit free and some mix of that and sort of a symbolic kind of sound, like what I would associate an image with that sound. Any questions about this piece?
Yes. Even though you have those symbols to express what you expect in the piece, would you say that when you're not playing it, when someone else plays it, do you expect a certain freedom in the piece in another person, or do you expect like really to be like, okay, this is a piece and you have to respect it, like I've written it?
Right. I guess somewhere in between a little bit. So one of the reasons that I wrote it like this with timeline and, you know, roughly 5 seconds in, this sound should happen, and I'm not using really precise, like this tempo, and then I have 30-second notes, and it should be in this exact rhythm, is so that the performer has some freedom. And even me, when I perform it, I'm half paying attention to what I wrote. I have, okay, I'm going to do some scratching sounds now for a little bit, but I also want to hit the other book, and then I'm closing it. So I really thought of it as this kind of like guideline for a semi-improvised thing, but at the same time, there's a very clear trajectory to the piece. The sound happens first, then this one, and the sequence of electronics cues kind of gives it a skeleton and structure to work around. But then even in terms of the performance practice, how you treat the object, how you move, how you stand, varies a lot from performer to performer. So most people, when they perform it, and it's quite a lot of people perform it now, maybe 30 different performers, so it's one of my most performed works. Perform it like I do, kind of at a table, hunching over a bit. Sometimes I have a taller table, so I'm not as hunched, right? But some people have sat down, you know, and brought more like theatrical performance as well. So there was one performer who was a pianist who played it sitting, and you know, he really spent a lot of time. And that performance took like 15 minutes rather than like 10 minutes. It's really cleaning up the theater of it and gradually bringing into the. So I think there's, yeah, a lot of freedom for interpretation, and I was interested in that. And like this, even though there are some conventional musical notations, the dynamics in particular, it's pretty easy to learn, I would say. Even for me, I've never studied an instrument, so I never went to school to learn to play any instrument, piano or anything. Came into composition through working on electroacoustic music, and then only learned musical notation, conventional notation, in order to compose for other people. So I've never been able to perform any of my own music until this piece, and then I wrote this for this percussionist, and I thought, after a while, saw maybe 10 performances of it from different people, I thought, I could do that. You know? It's not so hard, right? So that I think makes the piece in a way more accessible, and so it's interesting to try to think about it as something that could be played by other people like me who don't have a formal training on an instrument, and so it also can be played by musicians from different instrumental trainings. So It was commissioned by a percussionist, but as I mentioned, a pianist performed it, a trumpet player performed it, a violinist performed it. So it's interesting to see that those different kind of musicians with different physical practices and performance practices maybe have different ways of approaching the work. So this is maybe a good segue to talk about other works of mine that kind of go into the structure. So because I was really excited and intrigued about the possibility of having a performance practice of myself and developing other works that I could perform myself. And so this is one that is kind of a sequel, if you like, to this piece, thinking about other everyday objects that we can use. And it's a work in progress. I hope to be able to perform it soon, but I haven't yet had the time to develop the patch and everything. So it exists right now only as a video that I recorded as an improvised performance and then edited a little bit in post, and hopefully this year I'll be able to make a notation and make a way that it can be performed with live electronics. So this piece called Knowns, Reasons, Knowns, like to know, K-N-O-W, for an amplified wooden chair and electronics. And I guess another reason I couldn't perform it today is because I don't have a wooden chair here, and there's things like you have to drag it on the ground in order to make a squeaking effect, and there's carpet here, so So I'll just play maybe 5 minutes of this piece, and you can see maybe the evolution of my thinking about these ideas of what you can do with everyday object and sound, because this piece is now 10 years old. It's one of the oldest pieces in my catalog that I still perform. And this piece I made just 1 year ago. So 10 years later, different things that I tried to do. So I'll just play a little bit of it. Turn off this light in the back so you can see the screen better. So. first starting sitting, talking about sitting on the chair, and later standing. Exploring all the different parts. But you see also, like, I mean, in this video there are parts where it's like I'm really struggling to get a sound out of the object, right? And same thing with the book. So that's a big difference as well between a musical instrument that's designed to be reliable. You know, when you hit this note on the keyboard, it's going to sound the same way if you apply the same amount of pressure. But there's a certain chaos, you know, to the book that you might not respond in the same way, even if you apply the same amount of pressure. Of course, musical instruments are sensitive as well, and we all know like what humidity does to a violin and stuff like that. But humidity, again, in this, like how much pressure you can get out of your fingertips in order to make these squeezing sounds, or on the chair, you know, you might be kind of like trying to get it to squeak and it may not speak. So that's another reason why there's a degree of improvisation in these works. So next I'll move on and say what happens when we bring these everyday objects into a performance context with instruments. So I also write instrumental music on scores with conventional notation for performers. And so I wanted to try to bring these approaches together. And so one time when I had a commission to write a piece for string quartet, I had just finished an electroacoustic work where I went into the studio and recorded with a lot of everyday objects. Duct tape was one of them, pencil and paper was another, and the other objects that I brought into the studio were the instruments of the string quartet. So I took a violin, I took a cello, I took a viola, tried to make all different kinds of sound effects with them and make a piece out of it. So that's a piece that I composed at this same, talking about the French tradition. I composed that in the studios of Radio France at the GRM. And then having the string quartet commission right afterward, I was okay, I was just working with string quartet, maybe there's something I can do. So I tried to transcribe that entire piece, which I composed not thinking that it would ever be performed by musicians, for the instruments of the string quartet. So there are string sounds that they make, and I manipulated them, and I tried to think like, oh, if I added, granulation to this recorded sound of a violin, how can I reproduce that only by a violin performing now? And there were also these found objects in the pieces, so I had like buckets of dirt that I, put a shovel in with a microphone really close to it. And I thought, rather than trying to get the violin to make that sound, why not bring a bucket of dirt onto the stage and get the violinist to also play with dirt at the same time as they're playing with the violin. So this is my string quartet called Pre-Echo After Empties. The original piece was called Empties Impetus, so that's the thing, and I'll play a little bit again of this piece, little excerpts. So it's the beginning of the piece where you have first string quartet playing and then some dirt. Jump ahead to another part of the piece. There's also a lamp back there, so possibly lights. You get the idea. So that's, I suppose, one of the reasons I was interested in mixing the kind of object performance thing and instruments is to see if it kind of rubs off on each other. Like I was talking about that approach of, performing a book, you think about it a little bit differently than you would think about a violin. But if the two are happening at the same time, then maybe you start to think about the violin in the same way that you would an everyday object, and your attention is drawn toward the object itself, its physicality, its construction. I think music with extended techniques does this as well, where there's a kind of an estrangement of the instrument. When you're not playing it in the way that it was designed to be played, then your attention is drawn toward the object itself and its construction, maybe its history. And so, talking about history, this is a string quartet. I mean, in my mind, immediately when I think string quartet, it's something with a lot of history. There's a lot of historical baggage there. You know, we can remember, we think about Haydn and Mozart, you know, we think about all of this weight and meaning that the instrument carries that maybe you don't think about for too long if you go see a string quartet perform. You think that you're drawn, sucked into the music, you have your emotional response to it. And so I really wanted to think about the history of the string quartet in this piece. And so there are even like little hidden things in it where there are mimed performances of Beethoven string quartets and Lachenmann string quartets underneath the music. And so I wanted to have this quality of this, the weight of the object somewhere underneath the surface of the music. And so that's a little bit behind the idea also of using dirt, you know, it's almost like grave digging, you know, digging up the past by having a string quartet. So I'll play one last piece, excerpt, to kind of show the next step maybe in this kind of thinking about now the violin in its own context. There's no more objects on stage, but what's my way of approaching the violin as an object and trying to bring in different performance practices from object performance onto the violin. So it's a little bit this kind of extended technique idea, playing the violin as if it was something else. And so in this piece called Doubt is a Body, there's the violinist who performs on their instrument, and then there's a second violin that's suspended on stage, and it has a transducer speaker attached to it. So it's just vibrating against the body of the instrument and sending electronic sound into the second violin. And the electronics are amplified by the resonance of the violin. So it's like not a very high quality speaker, you know, like a speaker like this has a cone that's designed to amplify every frequency in the spectrum equally as best it can. And a violin will resonate according to its own kind of resonance and have a much more colored kind of sound. So I wanted to make the violin as an object strange by doing that and have the violin make other sounds coming out of it than normally it can make by playing on it. And then I wanted the violinist to perform on her instrument in a way that maybe you shouldn't on a violin, or thinking about it as if it were something else as well. So I'll play a little bit of that. you saw, treating the violin like a paper to write on, using the bow as if it were a pen, and then thinking about the violin as a microphone that you could speak into. There's a contact mic on the instrument, does that with the resonance of the body, coloring the sound, and then that recording that is recorded live on stage is sent to the transducer and the other violin, and it's repeated and looped and re-recorded, so she hears her own voice that she whispered into this violin in the other violin, goes to listen to it, because it's a speaker, so you listen to a speaker, and then because you have a microphone and a speaker, you bring them together, you make feedback, right? And so using the microphone violin with the speaker violin to treat them as if they were a speaker and a microphone rather than two violins. And so that was a little bit the thinking behind that section of the piece. And again, if you're interested, you're welcome to go online and listen to the whole piece. I think I'll end it there for my presentation of my works and open it up to more questions if you have any. I'll turn the light back on. Questions?
Yeah, well, more than a question, I just have a comment that, well, first I want to congratulate you because it's really great, your work. And what I truly appreciate is that it's obviously that you're always experimenting and you're always in the search for new sounds. But unlike many other composers that I've heard with this tendency of like real experimentation, your music has a very emotional content. And that's something that as a listener you always are thankful for, because experimentation, for me, it can always go to a certain point. But when it's about music, I'm always thankful when it makes me feel something, when it has this emotional compound.
Right.
So, well, that's my comment, but my question would be, are you aware of that? I mean, do you actually want this kind of emotional response in the listener?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think, everyone has their own relationship to music, and I don't want to say that it's wrong to be more analytical. I'm certainly analytical in my work as well, but I have emotions when I listen to music, I have emotions when I read a book, and I have emotions when I listen to sound, and that comes into the composition, and I want to express that, and I want to create a place for listeners to be able to express that with them in themselves and listen. So certainly, I don't know, for me the string quartet's a really emotional thing, and going to and listening to music that is performed on a string quartet, and also thinking about its history, and thinking about, with this piece in the violin, for example, your relationship with your instrument as a performer. And again, I don't have that training myself, but I imagine it's very personal, Your violin is your violin, it's your baby, it's part of your body almost, it's an extension of you. You express yourself through that object, and so there's so much emotion that's in that object and that is contained in that object. And then also that you learn from that object. I think that objects really are carriers of their own experiences, right? So listening to the violin isn't just about projecting their own emotions on it, but thinking about what's contained there. What memories does that violin have? And I think there's an emotionality to it. Other questions?
I have two questions. Did you fall off the chair? No, I'm just.
That's not in the final take.
No. First is regarding your piece Gnomes.
Mm-hmm.
Did you consider having a dancer, bailarina? I can't remember the translation. Having to perform that piece?
It would be great. Yeah, I think there exists not yet any performance version of the work, but I would love it if it were something that somebody coming from a different performance art background could approach.
Yeah,
so
especially because it's the main instrument is the body for
Yeah.
me in that piece.
Absolutely.
So that can be.
I had one other. There is a percussion quartet that I wrote for percussionists with 4 chairs as well, and so they were percussionists and performed it that way. But my feeling a little bit watching them all perform it was, maybe they should have more of a performance kind of background in their bodies. Yeah.
And the second question is, what would be your experience with balance with the string quartet and the electronics? Because for me, it's really complicated to have a string quartet, that's naturally amplified.
Mm-hmm.
You're using microphones, but at the same time you're using sound objects. So for the public or for the space, it might be difficult, no, to have a balance between the string quartet and the amplified pound object. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, it's making total sense. It's a good observation. And I think, maybe it's not fair to call it a string quartet. It's like a mixing console quintet with string quartet, right? So there is a fifth performer, and sometimes it's me. I've performed that work with the string quartet quite a few times, and it really takes somebody at the mixing console who is riding the faders at the whole time. And in that piece, there are no other electronics. It's just amplified string quartet and object. But the electronic performance is really quite involved in following the sound, making sure there's not feedback. And usually that work is also spatialized. So there are 4 speakers in the room, and it's kind of one violin is one speaker. Not 100%, but that way the writing in the score is also between the instruments designed to create a spatial movement so that within their little space on stage it's amplified into a wider space. But that work changes completely depending on what kind of hall it's performed in. We've performed it like in that recording you heard. It was quite a reverberant hall, but we've also played it in like little cafes where it's very dry acoustic and really different quality. So I think that's an interesting dimensionality about the work. But it does take a lot of care in the interpretation of the electronic part as well as the instrumental part.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, it relates with his question, maybe you already answered it, but in regards with the chair piece, again, like because it has like all this visual aspect that I think it's very important to the piece, and when you deal with objects, well, you have like this visual aspect. So my question would be like, how do you approach this visual performative aspect of the piece or theatrical aspect, or do you even consider or is it just like a random result of the sound exploration you're
good question. I think it's certainly not random, but I think that I do think of it from a musician's perspective, and the kind of physical actions that are required to produce the sound are what create the choreography, if you like, of the piece, rather than the other way around. Same idea as the earlier question about structure, like, am I thinking about this physical motion and what sound it can produce? No, I'm more thinking about the sound that happens when you explore it in a certain way, and that produces a physicality. But then when I'm performing that work myself, or in the case of the quartet, the performing chair quartet, the coaching and the rehearsal process then becomes a lot more like theater or dance, where you can't really communicate those things in a score, like I do have in the score, like a little symbol of a walking person now walk to the other part of the stage, and a little graphic of a chair, and I'll lift the chair or whatever it is, right, with an arrow. But then it's really the performativity of the work happens in rehearsals, where we say like, well, but what if you really lift it, bring your arms out more, or when you're dragging it across the stage, maybe what direction are you looking in? So then it becomes more this kind of hybrid interdisciplinary thing where as musicians we're used to our performance practice coming only from interpreting the score, but then it really is theater, it really is dance, as well as music. And so that can only happen when working directly collaboratively with the performer.
Like in regards to the works you've done with everyday objects, how important is it for you when you're writing and like discovering the sounds that is like in an organic way, that is like in a way that you approach the object the same way you would approach it like in an everyday scenario. It's like when you were performing with the book or like with the chair, I never saw you like taking the book and breathing into it or like taking it, or like with the chair. I don't know, we didn't see the whole video, but you at no point did you like lie down on the floor and like started like just knocking on the chair or something. So like, is it important for you to use these objects? In the last piece, it's different because you were actually trying to use the violin in a way that didn't resemble like that wasn't used like violin.
Mm-hmm.
But in those other pieces, is it important for you that it's like organic that way?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I mean, it's interesting to be able to work with these objects in multiple pieces and see different things that happen with it. So after I wrote this first solo book piece, I also wrote a book quartet that is only for amplified books and no electronics. And I think in that piece, I discovered other sounds and other ways of using the book than I did in the first piece. And so I think as I work with it more and more, then I discover more forms of strangeness and different ways of working with it. But I do think that my starting point is always coming from this kind of organic thing and thinking about how do I normally use the object. And it's the same thing with the violin, you know, I wrote a lot of violin pieces before I wrote that one, where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna play the violin the way it's supposed to be played, or the other, you know, extended ways that I've learned that other composers have worked with it before, and then taking it farther and farther out of its context into further forms of strangeness. But I think, yeah, the way my brain works is always coming more from that organic, like how is this object telling me to interact with it first?
And this dichotomy of using objects with acoustic instruments, do you have a hierarchy of, and you coming from this electronic, because you did your undergrad on electronics, right? So how do you prioritize like an instrument or an electronics based on what's more important for you, or you support both pieces when you write a piece? Do you support more an electronics or an object or an acoustic instrument? How does that work? Or it depends on what piece you write?
Of course it depends on the piece, because I also write purely electroacoustic works and purely instrumental works, but when they're both involved, I really do think of it as a kind of collaboration, because if I have an instrument, it's electronics, and so my own performance practice and my own importance is on the electronics, and that's, you know, as I approach the piece and compose the piece, that's where my thinking as a composer comes from, always, I would say. Always thinking about the sound and thinking about, with electronics, when you're working in the studio, you can hear the sound right away. When you're manipulating a recording, you get instant feedback, whereas if you're writing something on paper or using notation software, you might have an idea of how it's going to sound because of your training. You can go to the piano and play the pitch that it's going to sound as, but we never really hear exactly how it's going to sound until the performers approach it and they bring their own artistry to it and their own way of approaching it. So I think that it's kind of a multi-step process where if I'm making a mixed work with electronics and instruments, I'm first thinking, coming from myself and my own way of thinking about sound, and then having this response from the musicians and hearing how they think about the sound and how they perform it on their instruments makes the work complete, you know. And that's what I love so much about writing for instruments and collaborating with musicians. I think if I didn't have that experience, I probably wouldn't have too much interest in writing for instruments, you know, because I wasn't coming from a classical background. I don't have a great yearning to write for a string quartet. I don't need to write a string quartet. There are plenty of them out there, right? Why make more, right? But, there's this amazing string quartet. I love these musicians. They sound brilliant, and they want me to write a piece for them. Like, I should honor their performativity and what the sounds that they can make. And so getting the chance to work with somebody who spent their whole life with an instrument and put so much of themselves into it, and getting that as a response to something that I give them is just such a rewarding experience. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does.
This is more like a technical question. Actually, are two, but First, what's your software? Like, what type of process, how do you call it? Processor?
So
Do you use?
for this piece, reasons, I'm using Max MSP, so this is the patch a little bit here. You can see the performance mode where you're sequencing through the different steps. Underneath you have all my messy like cables and everything, right? But so yes, I use Max to coordinate the performance pieces like this, and also when I make an installation or something like that, it runs through Max. And then for working with the sounds, I've used all different kinds of DAWs, digital audio workstations. So first I learned on Pro Tools, I worked on Logic for a bit. Now most of these days I work on Reaper. But then that with a whole other host of plugins and tools. Again, Max for granulation. I use Bias Peak, which is no longer being produced for convolution and little micro sound processes. I use a lot of analysis software as well, Spear for spectral analysis, and that goes into my compositional process. But yeah, a number of different things.
Yeah. Okay. So, for example, when you are composing, like you know which effect, like you want to use, like from the beginning, or you're like, oh, let's try this. And, that's cool. Or like you experiment more.
I think my answer to that is very similar to the earlier question about performing the object the way it's supposed to be performed versus coming at it and thinking about making it strange or performing it in a different way. So I think as I first learned to work with electronics, it really did come from interacting with the software itself and thinking about how the software wants to sound, or if I have a sound, there's a playfulness to it, right? So coming from a point of improvisation, same thing as like going to the studio, improvising with the book to get a sound. When I first started working with electronics, it really came from this improvisational place where, okay, I have this recorded sound, I'm going to play around with the software to see what other sounds I can make from it. And now that I've been doing it for 15 years, I kind of know what to expect, right? So if I take this recording and I can imagine a sound that I want to achieve, I know that I should go use a granulator with this kind of window shape and this FFT size for the window and plug it in, and it's not as much of a playful approach, but that's always something that interacts, right? So I might come in with that idea and have that structure, produce it, but what it gives me back makes me want to play with it, and so there's always an element of improvisation there.
Last question. Have you thought in maybe doing something like a concerto? So I mean, like for an object and an orchestra, or an object and a string quartet, or whatever. Like I know a chair as a soloist and an orchestra. I don't know if you're familiar, for example, with the pieces by Kandun, for example, the water concerto, the paper concerto, or the ping pong concerto by Andrea Kio. You know, these kind of pieces, which, honestly, I think they work very well.
Yeah.
Even though the orchestra is used in a more traditional way, but the soloist has, you know, the full exploration of the object. Have you some kind of thought of doing something like that?
I would love to, yeah, but I guess I haven't quite had the opportunity yet, but that would be a really interesting thing to go to. The percussionist who commissioned this piece did say one day we should do a concerto like that, so I hope that that happens. I just completed my first concerto with orchestra and instrumentalist. That was for a cellist, and in that piece he does read a book, right? So I have these kind of thoughts that reappear in my work, right? So I have like little moments of these things in that work, but I think I would love to do a piece like that where there's one object performer and the whole, other instrumentalists behind them. There are other composers that I like who do this kind of work as well, like German composer Carola Bauchult does this kinds of works as well with objects. winter coats, where the performers are making squeaky sounds with the coats and these kinds of things, or Jennifer Walsh, Irish composer, who will sometimes have like maybe a theatrical performer, like a boxer plus string quartet. She has a piece like that, which I think is quite interesting, called Training of the Opposite. So yeah, I would love to. All right, last question.
Sorry. You already mixed, objects and conventional instruments. I was thinking maybe you could mix books and chair, and maybe call it the book club.
Yeah.
Maybe you could, I don't know, you play the chair with the book, like a bow.
Yeah, sure. There's one piece I wrote, a chamber ensemble piece called Indices or Kossuth variations, after the visual artist Joseph Kossuth, who has a lot of these like object photography pieces, where each performer has an instrument plus an object. So there is book and chair in that piece, and at one moment the violinist does bow her book. But also the harpsichordist has a broom with a sweep and so on. But yeah, I'd love to do more. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and for your attention, and thank you so much, Paula, for your
No problem.
invitation.